Welcome to all the listeners and all the viewers of this third installment of EJIL Live. I'm Joseph Weiler, and with me is young Klabbers, whose article, The Emergence of Functionalism in International Institutional Law, Colonial Inspirations, we are publishing in the third issue of 2014. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful piece, and I hope that people listening or watching will be encouraged also to go and read it. And let me see if I get the basic premise and structure of the article. So I think the first point you make, and it's a very, very important point, and we will come back to it, is that our entire international institutional law is consciously and very often subconsciously based on a functionalist premise, and that a tremendous number of legal answers which we give to various tricky international institutional law questions, especially when it comes to powers, competences, etc., are based on that functionalist premise. And one of the second point you made, you look at it in historical terms. And again, this is very often unstated, but there's a notion that both functionalism as the foundation of international institutional law and theorizing about functionalism at the foundation of international institutional law is a second half of the 20th century phenomenon. And at best, some people will go back to the turn to institutions at the end of the First World War and the establishment of the League of Nations and might trace it back to then, whereas you are saying, no, there are two things that we tend to forget. First of all, international institutional law existed before the so-called turn to institutions at the end of the First World War. And later on in this conversation, we will talk, how do we define international institutional law? When is it appropriate? And secondly, actually, the theoretical foundations for the functionalist approach to international institutional law were laid down by an American scholar, Reinsch, who operated in the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And not only were they laid out there quite extensively, but the claim is that he was inspired and took his cues in developing his approach to international institutional law and functionalism as its foundation by his interest in the colonial phenomenon. Do I get this right?
Roughly.
Roughly. You will flesh it out.
We'll flesh it out.
We will have our contestations later on. And then an important aspect of your paper, which it's not only the historical analytical, tracing the genealogy of the idea, but you also think that there are normative implications to these historical insights. Specifically, a more critical approach to the notion of functionalism as the basis of international institutional law. So maybe a good place to start before we begin to track the historical genealogy of functionalism is for you to tell us a bit what do you mean by functionalism as being the foundation, conceptual and theoretical foundation of international institutional law.
Oh, that's already a tough one. To my mind, functionalism is the idea that when organizations are set up, they are set up to perform a certain function, and that everything, that the whole legal edifice of the organization and the whole legal structure of them, the whole framework in which they are embedded, has to be regarded from that perspective. I think there is a lot of merit to that. There's a lot of explanatory force in functionalism. It can explain why organizations have the powers that they have. It can explain why they can have conditions for membership, admission, or expulsion. A good example, Liechtenstein being not admitted into the League of Nations in 1920 because the opinion prevailed that it was unable to contribute to collective security. That's a typical functionalist concern. It can help us understand why and how organizations are being financed by member state contributions, etc., etc. So it's of great importance. It's the predominant approach amongst international institutional lawyers and always has been.
And how does it translate into legal doctrines?
It translates into doctrines about attributed powers and implied powers most prominently. Those are perhaps the heart of international institutional law, and they can be traced back to this idea of functionalism. It translates into the doctrine of functional necessity when it comes to privileges and immunities of organizations.
So let's set it out. So tell me if I'm reading you correctly. So when it comes to competences and there are issues whether an international organization is transgressing its competences or not transgressing its competence, or transgressing its jurisdiction or not transgressing its jurisdiction, the functionalist approach will say it's not transgressing its jurisdiction if what it is doing is in fulfillment of its primary functions, at least. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to powers, like famously in injuries case, etc., if we are asking, do the institutions of the international organization have the powers to do something, the functional approach will say it should have, and it does have, the powers that are necessary for it in order to fulfill its functions. Otherwise, it would not be able to do what it is set up. And then you also say that it gets translated into what may be second-order doctrinal questions, although very important, like privileges, immunities, all necessary in order to fulfill its functions.
I think that's the gist of it, yes. So it has great explanatory force on those issues, but I think there's a limitation. That's not in the piece, because I only figured that out later. Two limitations, both stemming from the fact that functionalism is a theory on the relationship between the organization and its member states. That's the key, I think, to understanding functionalism. How do the member states and the organization interact? How do they stand across, against, and with each other? That leaves two important considerations out. That leaves out the internal workings of the organization, relationships between organs, for instance, how the Security Council and ECOSOC relate to each other is unrelated to functionalism. Functionalism doesn't have much to say about it. So the internal workings are excluded almost by definition. And this has been preoccupying me for a while now. The other thing that is excluded is the external relations of organizations, not so much in the field of treaty-making powers, but in terms of responsibility, accountability. That is something that cannot be traced back to the relationship between the organization and its members and tends to fall outside the purview.
Although in strict external relations of an organization, if we think, although in some ways it's sui generis, but if we think of the EU in foro interno and foro esterno, functionalism was also used to define treaty-making power of international organization, etc. But the black hole of all international institutional law has been the state responsibility of international organization, which the articles only partly really cover. There's also a normative dimension to functionalism, which you speak about in your paper. Why don't we talk about that a little bit?
Now, functionalism has always been presented and presented itself, and it goes back to the work of the early 20th century people, as being a force for good. There's a wonderful quote from Nagendra Singh, writing in 1958, his doctoral thesis, I think it was, on termination of membership of international organizations, where he says in the foreword that organizations contribute to the salvation of mankind. Now, that's quite a claim to make. And I think that has always been the underlying conception, and to a large extent still is. We tend to think of international organizations as being a force for good.
Because the premise, the normative premise is that cooperation between states is the opposite of bellicose relationships. So either on a liberal view of international law or communitarian view of international law, cooperation is always the goal. And international organization embodies cooperation, so therefore it's an unmitigated public good.
That's
and
right.
therefore functionalism does not only come as an explanatory or even a legal normative apparatus to give answers to legal questions, but functionalism is a good thing because the world is a better place if states get together to achieve the, of course, I mean, we could be playful and say states could get together to organize the slave trade, and that's a functionalist premise, but we would hardly, but I'm being a tiny little bit provocative to begin to ask the normative questions, which we will come back at the end of our conversation, as you do in your paper, where you raise some of the normative issues. How does, for those of us who are also students of European integration, functionalism and neo-functionalism were the theoretical underpinnings of European integration. David Mitrany with his functionalist theories, and then Ernest Hass and others with the neo-functionalism. How does that form of functionalism relate to the functionalism of international institutional law proper?
It shares, I think, the underlying normative sentiment, but there's different questions. Mitrany and Haas and Deutsch and Lindbergh, they were political scientists. They were interested predominantly, I would think, in trying to figure out how cooperation would beget closer cooperation, how you could come from cooperation on an ad hoc basis to more intense, to even integration in the end. Whereas the legal functionalist idea sort of shares that as an underlying axiom, but it's not too interested in figuring out how that works, the spillover effect or the logic of ramification that Mitrany talks about. What the legal functionalists do, what people like Reinsch do, is think, okay, that almost goes without saying. What we're interested in is how function determines the law, the legal structures embedded, in which international organizations are embedded. So how can we explain, or how can we set up an organization and then give it privileges and immunities? There the function becomes relevant. So they share a label, they share an underlying sentiment, if you will, but they ask different research questions.
But let me test the following on you, because when reading your piece, it occurred to me, because you mentioned, in the piece, Professor Klabbers deals with this difference between the sort of European integration functionalist theories and the general public international law, international institutional law. And it occurred to me that there might be a link between the political theory and legal development, that the interest of the political theorists of functionalism and neo-functionalism has, and I use this as a deliberate pun, a spillover effect into the attention that European Union law from its inception gave to the individual, because they were interested also in relations between individuals and not only relationship between states. You know, Jean Monnet famously writing, "Nous ne coalisons pas des États, nous unissons des hommes," and that's reflected in the legal framework. Whereas in public international law and international institutional law generally, the tenacity, for example, with which the WTO insists that it's an intergovernmental organization and really resists any incursion of those individual barbarians, is also part of that functionalist, this different functionalist ethos. And it might be an additional limitations to the one you mentioned before, that it's got a limited range of stakeholders. The stakeholders of the functionalist, the classical functionalist approach are states, and it's a wonderful public good if states, and maybe we should even be more precise, governments of states cooperate among themselves. But as global administrative law has been reminding us for quite a long time, and others as well, it can often be at the expense, the international cooperation on a functionalist basis among governments of state can be at the expense of democratic accountability, transparency. It can also be very corporatist, privileging special interests that have an impact on governments of states. So there's another limitation that comes by reflecting on the difference between European and general functionalist theories.
Yeah, and I think that follows naturally from the idea that functionalism in international institutional law is a theory on relations between states and their organization. It's states and their organization. It's not the peoples of the states and their organization. It has always been limited to states, yeah. So you're absolutely right.
Now, in your piece, I think you're very gentle, and you say that the functionalist premises of international institutional law become fully visible only quite recently. And I say you're being a little bit delicate and generous because I think that even today you can see quite a lot of writing on international institutional law, which will be based on functionalist thinking, which will use functionalist arguments to make doctrinal points, but will not be fully cognizant of the theoretical underpinning of functionalism in the way you've just explained to our listeners and viewers. And when you get into the history of the idea, now these are my words, there's a kind of black hole in the interwar period. It's as if there's acknowledged turn to institutions, but not fully articulating the functional spaces. How do you explain that black hole, that myopia, that almost disinterest, interested in what functionalism does for you, but not in explicating its foundational premises and means of operation?
I have no explanation for that. It's a simple answer. That goes to the sociology of science, perhaps, if you will. And that's, yeah. What I can imagine is that functionalism has a very strong intuitive appeal. It makes somehow perfect sense to think of organizations in terms of functions. So much so that you can make the comparison, and I think you've done this in the past with Molière's bourgeois gentilhomme. Everyone speaking the same language without realizing they're speaking the same language. Or was it prose poetry? I think that holds true to a large extent with functionalism, that I can only think of one international institutional lawyer of some repute, maybe two by now, who have not self-consciously, or have self-consciously considered themselves not to be functionalists. And that was Finn Seierstedt, and in his wake Nigel White, perhaps, having a more organic theory of international organizations. But everyone else has been swayed by the inherent logic, the normative appeal, no doubt, but also almost the practical appeal, if you will.
My teacher when I was a student was Derek Bowett. I studied international institutional law from Derek Bowett, so of course his book was the Bible. Now, I haven't gone back and checked, but I don't seem to remember that the word functionalism was ever mentioned in our course, even though it's a par excellence example of the functionalist approach. So you don't have an explanation. Can I just try something on you? Usually the people who write on international, so it goes to the sociology of the profession. Usually the people who write about international institutional law also believe in international institutional law, in that kind of normativity. The world is a better place if we have international organizations because it's a form of cooperation between states. It's the way that the first wave of people writing about judicial review of legislation by courts believed that it would make, my great teacher, Mauro Cappelletti, did not only analyze judicial review in the contemporary world, but he thought it was a messianic book that he wrote. This is, salvation will come from judicial review. So I think there's also a certain messianic element to the writing about international institutional law, because the world will be a better place if we are within the framework of international organizations. But it's more difficult to sell it to skeptical states very keen to preserve their sovereignty and maybe a little bit suspicious of international organizations. So if you explicate the functionalist premise, it might make the idea of international organization less appealing, more threatening, because, for example, the competence implications are you never know what you're buying into. You think you write down these are the competences, and suddenly somebody will say, no, the competences are everything that are necessary to... so maybe there's a self-preservation. Is that a potential explanation for this black hole?
That's more than a potential explanation, I think. And what occurred to me while you were speaking is also that many of the people who had a great influence on the development of the law were practitioners with international organizations. Think of Clarence Wilfred Jenks, think of Amartya Singh, think of a bunch of other people. They would be working like Jenks for the ILO and write a lot extolling the virtues of functionalism. Having said that, there's also been, and I think that's why you're on the right track, if I can put it in that way. Already in the work of Reinsch, you'll see an attempt to persuade states that all this stuff that international organizations do is functional, it's there with technical, it's there with limited. And if organizations threaten to run wild, then they can always be controlled by their member states. The member states remain Herren der Verträge, as Eveling, I think, once put it. That idea is already visible in the work of Reinsch 100 years ago, that organizations are extensions of national sovereignty rather than in competition with national sovereignty, an idea that you also find in the Wimbledon case of the Permanent Court in a slightly different form. So there is that element as well, that functionalism has always insisted on the purely technical nature of functional cooperation. The only thing political about it would be world peace. Like it would sort of inexorably.
Yeah, but you know, world peace is motherhood and apple pie, so to speak. Who can be against world peace? So enter Reinsch. Tell us a little bit, who is Reinsch, what is his background, and then let's introduce him to our conversation, because in a way he's the intellectual hero of your article.
Yeah. I was tempted to say hero and villain, but he's not really a villain, I think.
In our modern approach, all heroes we like to show their warts and all, and their defects and weaknesses.
Right. Now, Reinsch was born in Milwaukee, I think, in Wisconsin, out of a German origin family. Became a lawyer there, got a bit fed up with practicing law, started to read politics and history, became assistant professor first in politics, wrote his PhD, and that's of some importance perhaps later on the reception of colonialism in the American colonies. So the reception of English common law in the colonies. Quickly started to teach around the turn of the century, in the year 1900 or thereabouts, started to teach courses on international relations, wrote a few things on colonial administration, over the years became something of an Orientalist, started to write about international organizations. 1907, 1908, 1909, 1911 is the year in which this major book is published. And then became finally Woodrow Wilson's ambassador to China, the minister in China, where he resigned after the Versailles Treaty, gave Shantung to Japan, something he wasn't very happy with and felt really betrayed. He had this very strong, progressive liberal, today you would call him a liberal. He ran for the Senate, a bit reluctantly, it turns out, according to his biographer. His friends sort of kept pushing him, like he should run for Senate.
And he went down to a clamorous defeat.
Yep, he must have been a bit disappointed at that, but he probably didn't give it his all.
He ran as a Democrat.
Yep.
And in Minnesota, right?
Wisconsin.
In Wisconsin, yeah. Which has got a tradition of being a very liberal state in the United States, but he went down to
13% of the vote.
13%. But you know, the Republican Party then had it was a different party than it is today, and the Democrats were a different party. It doesn't quite fit the tabs we put on them today. And he wrote in issue number 1 of the American Journal of International Law, he wrote one important piece, and that was followed by a second piece a couple of years later.
Yep.
And then he put them together in a kind of book, which is not exactly a monograph, but tried to pull together all the threads. So maybe outline for us in a synthetic way the principal points that he made in those 2 articles and in the book, because that's the foundation for our contemporary international institutional law and to functionalism as it's foundation.
Yeah, well, he started to look at the various unions that had been set up in the late 19th century, how they worked, how they were set up, how they were financed.
Such as the International Postal
The Postal
Union.
Union, the Telegraphic Union, as it was, the International Bureau for Weights and Measures, the Sugar Union, all those clubs that were from the 1860s on set up. And what he wasn't
Professor Klabbers says, you know, as if all of us know about these, but I'm sure that anybody who studied international law in the last 50 years have never heard of the Sugar Union, so it's good to hear about them. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, that's no problem. So anyway, a bunch of clubs were set up in the 1860s, 1870s, and beyond. Some other people had looked at them from different perspectives. There's wonderful stuff coming out of Germany on the intellectual property union as it existed by Friedrich Meili, writing in 1889, I think. Gustave Moignet, who had written or had set up the Red Cross together with Henri Dunant, also wrote a short volume on international unions. But those remained limited to a sort of a superficial overview of what those entities were doing without really drawing things together. And I think the first who started to do that to some extent was Pierre Kazansky, but Kazansky wrote mainly in Russian. He had 2 short articles in French. But Reinsch picked that up very nicely and was, I think, the first, at least the first that I've been able to come across, the first to really start to synthesize things. He started to notice, hey, the Sugar Union is set up in a certain way. The Intellectual Property Union, the Union of American Republics, the International Bureau for Weights and Measures, and they all share similarities. They're all set up in similar ways. And the thing he found, and here he, I think, drew inspiration from Jelinek, was that they were all organized around this idea of a function. So that was one of his big insights, I guess, that they were all organized around one of those, around the idea of a function, that you could thus meaningfully compare them, because that's what they have in common, even if otherwise they don't have much in common, like the Sugar Union and the Bureau for Weights and Measures probably didn't have all that much otherwise in common, but they were both set up in accordance with this idea of a function. So he started to look closer at that and started to draw conclusions on that basis and gave it, theoretical is maybe not the word yet, but a larger impact, because this was a trend that was going on. There was not just one union, no, there were around 30 or so at the time he wrote, and they all had this similar setup, they all had similar ideas, they were all organized according to function. So he also started to think about what this would mean for the world at large. His idea then, and the thing that, especially in the book, in the introduction to the book, which it comes out a bit less in the articles, that this might be the way to reconcile sovereignty and cooperation. So he is the first to formulate that in any explicit manner. At least the first to do that in English. That's of course a limitation. As I said, Kazansky wrote mainly in Russian. Kazansky did his PhD in 1897, I think. What I've understood is that it's a 3-volume, 1,360-page work on international institutions. But it's in Russian, and I don't read Russian, and I don't think Reinsch did either. So Kazansky has been...
One of our viewers or one of our readers or one of our listeners who reads Russian, here I am as the editor of EJIL, we would very much like to write, to publish a critical view of Kazansky's big magnum opus there.
Fascinated by that, very much intrigued. But anyway, so in the Western-speaking world, can you say that? I just did. In the Western-speaking world, Reinsch must have been the first. And then you'll see that that's later picked up by other people, including Frank Sayre, who wrote a wonderful little book, or an intriguing little book. Wonderful is maybe not the right word.
And did he already work out some of the doctrinal implications from the functional basis, that this would in some ways determine competences, that this could have an impact on powers? Is that get worked out a little bit in his work?
That gets worked out a little bit, especially on issues of financing. Like he relates that, and he's constantly downplaying the cost of cooperation, both in political terms, you don't give up national sovereignty, but also in financial terms. He's very keen on pointing out with every organization he discusses that the budget is limited. And,
So one of the really interesting parts of your article is when you get to that part where you are explaining his work to the reader, you say that he tries to square the circle. Mm-hmm. And you give 6 factors in which he tries to square the circle. So I don't intend you now to give us all 6 factors. We have to leave some incentive to people to actually go and read the article. But maybe you can explain to us first, what is the circle that needs squaring? And just maybe 1 or 2 examples of how Reinsch tries to square that circle.
I think the circle that he identified as needing squaring is the potential conflict, as you sketched earlier, between national sovereignty and international cooperation. That states might be reluctant to engage in cooperation if only they would realize that it might come at some cost. So the financial cost is downplayed, but also the political cost. It does not entail giving up sovereignty. No, it's an emanation of sovereignty, as the Permanent Court would put it 2 decades later. I think that is one of the main considerations, and that has a number of implications. That would, for instance, imply this limitation of functionalism to technical cooperation. And he goes so far that the sugar union, which was set up in 1902, for instance, was very much ahead of its time. It could set independent sugar prices. And he downplays that, because that is to be seen as an encroachment, perhaps, on state sovereignty, on the sovereignty of the member states. So he downplays that. He sort of quickly brushes over that, because that would not really fit the framework too much. And I'm guessing for the same reason he would be very reluctant perhaps to see the European Union today as an example of functionalism, which I sort of share with him actually. So that would be one implication. But the main squaring of the circle would be this sovereignty versus cooperation.
And can you illustrate to us 1 or 2 of the ways in which he actually tries to square the circle? Sort of say, yes, it is cooperation, but don't be worried.
No, yeah, by constantly downplaying, for instance, the political nature of cooperation.
Now, was he aware of the political nature of cooperation, or is that something that I wasn't sure from reading your piece? I had a feeling that he would swear on the Bible. He did go to a Lutheran school.
Yep.
He would swear on the Bible that these things are purely functional and not political. He wouldn't have made that move, that you can be as functional as you want and still be very, very, there are deep politics involved.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think he was downplaying it, but not in bad faith, if that's the way to put it. That he had a sincere idea that whatever the Sugar Union would do, whatever the International Bureau for Weights and Measures would be purely technical, would be literally functional cooperation between states to achieve a certain function, and there would be nothing political about it. There is
And also what you said before, that as masters of the treaty, since this is a treaty, if the member states don't like what's going on, they can always, the hand that maketh is the hand that breaketh. But maybe glossing over, maybe he himself didn't work that out, that in a multilateral treaty, the unilateral action becomes at least high cost.
Yeah, and I think his good faith was also such that he could not imagine organizations to do anything that would be irreconcilable with that functioning. So he could, and I think that holds true until then, probably the 1970s or so, maybe it's 1960s, that the idea that organizations could do wrong was perfectly anathema for him, but also for strings of successors.
Right, states can do wrong.
States can do wrong. States
not
go to war and
organizations.
stuff. But
that's another nice thing that sort of comes out of your article. It's why the law of the international responsibility of international organization lags so much behind states. It's not only because they have a problem of subjecthood, it's because how would we imagine that international organizations could do wrong for which they should be held accountable and there would be responsibility, etc.? Yep. That's deep in Reinsch, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's very deeply ingrained and still to some extent. Well, of course, since the collapse of the Tin Council and the territorial administration by the UN, it's sort of become accepted that at least hypothetically organizations can do wrong. What still remains to be seen is how that can be controlled. And
so let's move to the colonial dimension, because you even put it in your title. So in your explanation of Reinsch, now I want to be a little bit cautious here, because typically when we invoke colonialism as an explanation for anything in today's world, it comes with a pejorative, derogatory set of associations. And typically we see that in the wonderful work of, say, Tony Angie or Monica Garcia Salmones talking about Oppenheim. The way it comes out is that they thought or pretended to have noble objectives, but in fact the legal constructs were defending nefarious interests, etc. So, whereas I must say that reading your description of Reinsch, and I confess that I did not go to my very prized first issue of the American Journal of International Law to reread the article, I don't think that that accusation sticks to him. So let's explain to us in what sense you think he's colonially inspired, because I really want the viewers not to automatically jump to the conclusion, Jan Klabbers unmasked the Reinsch's dark side.
Yeah, no, the article has the subtitle Colonial Inspirations, and it took me a while to come up with the right words, and I'm still not sure whether that's the right word, but the point is it's not called Colonial Origins. I think that would have been way too strong. I think for Reinsch, the colonialism came up in two ways. One is methodological, and the other is, like for him, colonialism was a form of cooperation, at least much of it. He was aware that there were forms of colonialism which were far more nefarious. He was very critical of King Leopold's reign in the Congo, for instance, and wrote really like flaming pamphlets against that. But for a colonialism which would be benign or compassionate or helpful, he had some patience. He was a progressive Democrat, a liberal in today's terminology.
But even there, it's not the white man's burden, it's not this kind of paternalistic. Could it be because he's American and the United States didn't have that kind of imperial colonial ventures in quite the same way as France, Britain, Belgium, Germany, etc.?
I think that's part of it.
That for him, in a way, colonialism was, he became very Philo-China. That explains his resignation, etc. It was really an expression of don't be insular, be open to the world rather than dominate the world and bring them the benefits of your civilization.
Don't be insular. He had three ways he figured out in which world peace could be achieved in the longer run. One was open trade, free trade. The other was colonial administration, and the third would be international organizations. And they're all three aspects, three sides of the same coin, I'm tempted to say, but of course a coin only has two sides. But three aspects of the same mindset. Cooperation in one way or another, be it through exchange, be it through helping out someone who is less advanced, I guess he would have put it, or then by means on the footing of equality within international organizations. And for him, those were simply three different techniques of achieving the same result. So it lacks, his brand of colonialism lacks to some extent the pejorative connotation that we would give it nowadays.
Not entirely, but not quite in the same unmasking way that we...
I would have hesitated to give this a Tony Engie-like twist, shall we say.
So here is something that I found quite provocative, and again, I think you were very gentle, but I want to a little bit press you on that. So when going back to the functionalist premise and foundation of international institutional law, you say that's been the prevalent mood, that's been stated or unstated. And then you give some recent alternatives. And one of the alternatives that you give is the people who look at international institutional law, international organizations in with a constitutional vocabulary. And you, in some ways, oppose or distinguish between the sort of constitutional approach to international organizations and the functional approach to international organization. And I think there's a lot in what you say to distinguish it. But what I found so interesting and provocative, and I had not quite seen it in the same way before, that I can see the sort of colonial fervor of Reinsch, his brand of colonialism as a means for cooperation and peace and progress, which is part of his functionalist approach, and the same fervor which animates the constitutionalists. It comes from the same place, and it might also have the same normative shortcomings that the constitutional approach has got also a deep colonial dominating thing, and that's why we see the rise of constitutional pluralism. It's the discomfort with the hierarchy that comes with the vocabulary of constitutionalization. So there might be an interesting link between discovering that form of colonial part of the rise of functionalism to what you present as its alternative, which is a constitutional approach to international institutional law, and yet I see many very similarities.
I hadn't thought of that before, but I see where you're going. Yep, there is a certain similarity, at least in mindset, if nothing else. Yeah, it would be interesting to explore that in greater depth at some point.
So let's sort of move a little bit towards closure and get to the normative dimensions of your article. And maybe you set them out. You conclude the article with, in a way, 2 normative lessons. What are those?
If I remember correctly, one is that we should maybe approach international organizations a bit more critically than we have done in the past. I think there's another reason for that, if you'll allow me to get back to that in a moment. The second lesson would be that control is the black hole. This time it's my word, not yours, the black hole of functionalism. The first lesson, the more critical viewing of international organizations, I think also has something to do, not just with, it's too easy, as you sort of suggest, to say they were created out of a colonial mindset and hence we should be critical. And I try to avoid that, although I probably haven't avoided that altogether. But the word inspiration in the title is hopefully a softening of any pejorative stance there. One thing, though, that enters that particular conversation about whether we should critically approach international organizations is that the idea of international organizations itself has never been crystallized in a proper way. If you'd be forced to give an example of a technical functional organization these days, you'd probably come up with something like the World Health Organization or maybe the Food and Agriculture Organization. You would not immediately think of the UN, I think, anymore as strictly functional. You'd probably not think of the European Union as strictly functional in the sort of terms that would be recognizable to Reinsch. They have both sort of moved beyond that, which also has implications for the explanatory force of functionalism. Then there's a bunch of organizations which can be called functional in one way or another, but which are, from a different perspective perhaps, not so much geared towards world peace, like you can say with the World Health Organization, that's the prototypical example of an organization which aims to do good and, barring incidents, tends to do reasonably good stuff. Others tend to be more along the lines of interest groups for their member states. Think of OPEC, that's maybe the most prominent example. OPEC is considered by many to be an international organization, but it was attempted to prosecute it a few years ago in the US for antitrust violations, which also makes some sense. It's not just the critical approach towards international organizations should not just stem from this faintly colonial heritage, and maybe to some extent that heritage is more in the method than in anything else. Because what Reinsch did, he looked at how different colonial forces had been governing colonial territories, and he would make comparisons between how the French had dealt with tax issues in Algeria and how the Dutch had done that in Indonesia, that sort of thing. It's a very comparative approach, which also underlines functionalism in the law of international organizations. And I think that at least he got from his familiarity with colonial government. But get back to the previous point, the notion of international organization itself remains to be crystallized. We don't really know what they are.
There, I think both re-examining Reinsch and reading with care your article might give us some powerful analytical tools, or at least analytical intuitions, exactly to do that, to re-examine international organizations. And I'm thinking that, and the work of Guy Sinclair, our very own Guy Sinclair, is also very useful in that respect. I'm thinking that the way functionalism in the Reinsch sense is actuated is through institutionalization. It's a functional, there are two functional premises. First of all, the organization is functional. It's about sugar, it's about postal union, it's about trade. So it's not political, don't worry. It's just helping us do things in a better way, in a more efficient way. And then it's institutionalized. So instead of, as you point out in your article, in some of the early organization, there were no institution. There was just the state who hosted the organization also took care of the post, so to speak, and sending letters. But then you have institutionalization, and then automatically the question of the powers of the institutions, the authority, the scope of the organization, and that's where functionalism begins to show its expansive tendencies. That, wait a minute, I just wanted to do something about trade, and now they're telling me that it has implications for the environment and human rights. And I think, reading carefully your article and reflecting, we see an ambivalence. If I want to be dramatic, states have an ambivalence. They like the functional organization. That's why we have such a proliferation. 450 various forms of free trade agreement, or the thousands of bilateral investment treaties. So they like the functionality and what it does, but they have a certain phobia to certain aspects of the functionalist premise, and the way they deal with it is through weak institutionalization. And I can think of 2 or 3 examples. So one is indeed the world of investment. We have thousands of bilateral investment treaties, but the attempts to have a multilateral investment agreement failed. And I think that one of the reasons it fails, it's that phobia against the marriage between institutionalization and functionalism. When you put the two together, it becomes very strong medicines for states. So by keeping it at a bilateral level, they feel that they avoid that potent mixture. Or I remember in the WTO, the huge discussions of what one would call it. No, it cannot be the World Trade Court. It's an appellate body. It's the fear that functionalism married together with institutionalization produces, threatens. And ASEAN, on which I've been working very hard recently in a major project, it might also be a perfect example of that. It's very ambitious in its functionalist desires, ambitions, objectives. It's more expansive in that respect than the European Union. Unashamedly, they do security, things that for a long time in Europe were properly taboo. They do culture, again, which in Europe for a long time was taboo because it went outside, but with tremendously weak institutionalization. The Secretariat of ASEAN is tiny. It has a budget which is by many factors less than the budget of the municipality of Florence. The Secretariat employs in its legal service 2 lawyers. And I think that is another way where in practice the circle that Reinsch identified is trying to be squared. Let's take some of the benefits of functionality but protect ourselves. And that goes to your point that we really, in the light of this, we need to start rethinking what do we mean by an international organization in terms of the dilemmas that he raises.
Yep. Now you see that all over the place, the COPs and MOPs under environmental agreements, the G8 or G20, the contact group on piracy off the Somali coast, like a vague network of organizations, states, the insurance industry, the seafarers, trade unions, cooperating on a very specific function for probably a specific and probably limited period of time. And in a framework or in an institutional setting that can only be called weak. I once spoke to the former chairperson of the contact group on piracy of the Somali coast, and he said at any given point I had no clue as to who exactly the members were, which is indeed weak institutionalization, if nothing else. So there are all those.
And do you have in the background the sense that some lawyer told some delegation or some government, stay away from international organizations. They are based on functionalism, and once you get into it, you know where you go in, you don't know where you go out.
Not in those terms, perhaps, but I think the warning has been given, yeah, most likely, that there is a sense of mission creep, if you will, inevitably bound up with any halfway strong institutional structure, and probably even with institutional structures that may not be all that strong. That they do have a tendency to expand, and that therefore it might be politically wiser to start at a very low level of institutionalization.
And the normative, the normative part of the normative critique is not, the Jesse Helms approach. This is taking sovereignty away from states or from governments of states, but there's a different normativity. Very often, the functional approach takes away some of the gains of democracy, transparency, accountability. So increased cooperation amongst government and squeezing out other stakeholders that have made very significant gains within states. You transfer it to, so it's not just a knee-jerk of the Foreign Office. We have to remain in control, but it's also a broader constituency which could be develop a healthy skepticism of some of the functionalist implications of international institutional law.
That was already visible in Seattle 15 years ago, I guess. That civil society also steps up and thinks, hey, wait a second, what is happening here? And that was against the WTO, which in institutional terms is maybe not the strongest example of an international organization. So you see that same kind of discussion against the World Bank and the IMF, and where it probably has a bit more traction still. So, yeah, no, that also helps explain, no doubt, the emergence of global administrative law and other ways of trying to combat the increasing power, the increasing public power of international organizations.
But at the end of the day, at the risk of abuse, there's a tragic dimension to it. Because on the one hand, these international organizations do foster cooperation. They do enable us to achieve goals which would be very difficult to achieve at a state level. They do create an interdependence which militates against armed conflict or non-peaceful bellicose resolution of conflict. On the other hand, there's this price that we've just been talking about. So it's not an easy normativity. There's something almost tragic in it, you know, sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't.
I think that's accurate, and maybe one more reason why we should try to come up with a more sophisticated way of even defining and categorizing organizations. Because as it is, we all put them on one giant heap, whether it's OPEC or the World Health Organization or NATO or even the European University Institute, if I'm not mistaken. We call them all international organizations. In a way, they're all forces for good, but they're not necessarily forces for the same good or for everyone's good. So maybe a more sophisticated understanding thereof would not be amiss.
With these wise words, I want to thank you very much. I want to thank our viewers and listeners and encourage you. There's EJIL Talk, and now there's also EJIL Live. Spread the word. Thank you all very much.